morning, children. Welcome to Nelly Voice, a vibrant e-learning platform. Children, in today's session, we are going to continue with Unit 4, Our Environment. In this chapter, today we are going to learn about food chain and food web. So let us learn about what is food chain and what is food web. Living organisms need food to perform their life process. Isn't it, children? Without food, can we able to survive? No. To continue our life process, we need food, isn't it? Some organisms can produce their own food, such as plants. So plants can able to prepare their own food, isn't it, children? So while other organisms cannot do this and need to feed on other organisms to obtain their energy. We can therefore identify different types in an ecosystem based on how organisms obtain its food, and they are producers and consumers. So let us see about producers. Producers are organisms that are able to produce their own organic food. They do not need to eat other organisms to do this. Producers are also called as autotrophs. Plants are producers. Yes, children, plants are producers because they make their own food by the process of photosynthesis. So let us see about consumers. What are consumers? Organisms which cannot produce their own food and need to eat other organisms as food. These organisms are called consumers. All animals are consumers as they cannot produce their own food. Yes, children, animals cannot produce their own food. So they depend on other organisms for their food. So consumers are also called as heterotrophs. Now let us see about the types of consumers. We have different types of consumers like herbivores, carnivores, omnivores and decomposers. Let us see about herbivores. Herbivores are animals which eat plant or plant products. Example, cattle, deer, goat, rabbit, etc. So next is carnivores. What are carnivores? Carnivores are animals that eat other animals. Example, lion, tiger, frog and owl, etc. Next we'll see about omnivores. What are omnivores? Animals that eat both plants and animals are called omnivores. Example, humans, dog, crow, etc. Now let us see about decomposers. What are decomposers? They are the organisms that break down dead organisms and waste like fungi or bacteria. They obtain energy by decomposing them. Examples, bacteria, fungi, etc. Now let us see about food chain. What is food chain? Flow of energy in an ecosystem is one-way process. The sequence of organisms through which the energy flows is known as food chain. So this sequence of who eats whom in an ecosystem is called as food chain. It describes how organisms get energy and nutrients by eating other organisms. So this is the food chain seen in terrestrial ecosystem. So here you can see the plants are eaten by the grasshoppers, and the grasshoppers are eaten by the frog, and the frogs are eaten by snake, and the snakes are eaten by the hawk, and finally hawk is decomposed by the microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. So this is the food chain seen in terrestrial ecosystem. Next, let us see about the food chain seen in aquatic ecosystem. So in this system, we can see the phytoplanktons. What are phytoplanktons? Phytoplanktons are tiny plant, microscopic plants seen in the aquatic system. So the zooplanktons feed on phytoplanktons, and the small fish, they feed on zooplanktons. Large fish, they feed on small fish, and finally whale feeds on large fish. So this is how the energy flows from the phytoplankton to whale. Thus we conclude the primary energy production in the world of living things is made by plants, and that is by photosynthesis. So now here you can see the energy flow. The energy flow is greater in the producers. That is, at the base of this pyramid you can see the plants, and the plants are eaten by the rabbits. From the plants, energy is transferred to the rabbit. From the rabbit, the energy flows to the snake. From the snake, the energy flows to the hawk. So that is how the energy from the producers are passed to the tertiary consumers. Now let us see what are the trophic levels. We see that energy is passing along from the producers to consumers, isn't it, children? But there are three different consumers in any food chain. How can we distinguish different consumers? Animals that eat plants are called primary consumers. What are primary consumers? Animals that eat plants are called primary consumers. Animals that eat primary consumers are called secondary consumers. Animals that eat primary consumers are called secondary consumers. Animals that eat the secondary consumers, they may be mostly predators, okay, or the tertiary consumers. So what are tertiary consumers? Animals that eat the secondary consumers are called the tertiary consumers. There may be even large predators that eat tertiary consumers, and they are called as quaternary consumers. Each of these levels in the food chain is called a trophic level. Now let us see what is the energy pyramids. Organisms uses up to 90% of its food energy for all its life process. Only 10% of energy goes into new body cells and will be available to the next animal when it's get eaten. This loss of energy at each trophic level. So there is a loss of energy at each trophic level can be shown by an energy pyramid like this. So in this energy pyramid you can see the producers are with large energy, and it is while it is passing through the tertiary consumers, you can see very minimum amount of calories are there. So there will be a loss of energy at each trophic level. So now let us see some of the importance of food chain. Why food chain is important? Learning food chain helps us to understand the feeding relationship and interaction between organisms in any ecosystem. So it helps us to understand the feeding relationship and interaction between organisms. Understanding the food chain also helps us to appreciate the energy flow and nutrient circulation in an ecosystem. This is important because pollution impacts the ecosystem. The food chain can be used to understand the movement of toxic substance and their impacts. Now let us see about food web. What is food web? Consumers have different sources of food chain in an ecosystem and do not rely on any one species for their food. If we put all the food chain within an ecosystem together, then we end up with many interconnected food chain, isn't it, children? So this is called a food web. So if number of food chain within an ecosystem is put together and they are all interconnected by food chains, so this is called a food web. A food web is very useful to show the many different feeding relationship between different species within an ecosystem. So, we come to the end of today's session. We'll continue in our next session. Thank you, children.